Okay, well, let's continue our conversation about nurturing the community that is attempting to develop the community, your smaller team. And this work builds on what we talked about a moment ago in our communities of practice conversation, because we talked about the importance of describing what we have as shared interests, and that includes the principles that we consider to be important. A lot of work has been done with the idea of where do we start. And one of the more common outcomes of that work, one of the more popular views, is that we should start with shared principles in our work. And I believe in that very strongly. So let's talk about how come it's important for us to do that within our internal community, and then when we go out and deal with the community as a whole. And before we do that, let's remind ourselves of something we learned a few weeks ago. What do we actually mean by principles? Let's start by talking about a word we use all the time, values. A value is really anything that we consider important. It's anything we value. So for example, you might value your family, and therefore you might spend more time with your grandparents. You might value the outdoors, and therefore spend more time outdoors. Or you might value your spiritual activity, and therefore spend more time doing that. All of those are things that you might consider important. Fairness, sportsmanship, charity, health, all of them are examples. But not all of those things rise to the level of principles. Principles are a subset of values that must be held by people in a particular type of group. For example, if you're a police officer, you had better value the law. It's really not supposed to be possible to be a police officer that doesn't hold that principle. Or if you're a dietitian that doesn't think that healthy eating is important, you're probably not a very good or even probably not a real dietitian. So in other words, principles are things that everybody within that particular group or community say that they consider to be important. They're the cores of what they do. Another way of putting it is they're foundations. These principles lead to the norms, the ways that we'll be, the practices that we have, in particular the practices that we'll have toward one another and towards everybody, ultimately, that'll be affected by our community work. So for example, when Kirsten and I wanted to do some work around homelessness, one of the very first things we said to each other is, well, how do we want to work together? And then we went out to the community and said, here's some of our values. How do you feel about them? We refined them. And those values, not only as it turned out, were talking about how we were going to be with each other in the room, but we felt that what was good for the goose was good for the gander, and we decided to apply those ideas to how we dealt with the entire community. For example, the idea of dignity and of treating people with an opportunity to exercise their own power were both captured and continued. Why does it matter? Well, this is kind of a weird slide because I want to start at the bottom and work our way up. It's basically a platform. If you remember, we started off by saying, well, let's figure out what the problem is that we are going to try to address. We called that problematization. It was step one in our translation process. But then we said, let's get people interested. How did we do that? And one of the ways that we did that is by having people stop and think about the things that they cared about and then seeing where they shared those values or what they had in common with us. And those became our principles. And so the green square or the green level is really an example of where we're going to go from. Everything else is founded on that. And that was a way for people to know whether or not they wanted to come to the meetings or participate or buy the product or participate on the social media campaign. And because of those principles, we attracted more people and eventually became capable of developing productive work that included outlining our specific practices, our policies, the people's roles. Remember, we talked about enrollment and what are the things we're going to actually say to people, the key messages, and the procedures we'll use. And what goals and outcomes will we try to achieve? And then being able to go and measure to see whether or not you're actually achieving those outcomes. So we learned before the importance of establishing the problem, but if you immediately try to jump from establishing the problem to talking about what you're going to do, you'll find that you have nothing but chaos, and sometimes worse, lots of conflict. So it might seem a bit of a time waster at time to slow down and look at what your principles are. But it's really, really fundamental. And not only do you need to do it at the beginning of your process, but you need to constantly go back and revisit it, especially when new people are coming aboard or at milestones, such as you've just had a celebration of success or you've had some challenge or crisis that's occurred. Stop and look at the principles as a way of guiding what you do next. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. What would be your principles if you are a group working to sell hamburgers in an era where fewer people are eating fast food or meat? If you're working with your group right now, pause your video and see if you can come up with some of these to sort of exercise the muscles of coming up with principles. After you pause the video, come back and check to see what ideas you might have thought about. Did you consider ideas such as honesty, sustainability, responsiveness to your customers, as well as accountability to all of the people who are investors in your business or to government regulators, for example, meat inspectors? And did you consider ensuring that your team or community included people of diverse cultural backgrounds so that you didn't just sell to one group of people? And did you make a decision to value science over sales? In other words, to make marketing decisions that were based in something that was actually true and factual rather than just what people might buy? What might happen if you ignored one of these principles? For example, if you didn't think about people who have a culture that doesn't eat meat, perhaps you would be cutting out a huge part of your market. If you didn't think about being honest with regulators, perhaps you'd be putting your whole business model at risk because overnight somebody might actually charge you with selling something that was improperly labeled. And those are just a couple of the things that could happen if you didn't really comprehensively approach your principles. And by the way, I'm sure you came up with many other and better than this. Here's another problem. And again, understand the problem, then take a moment and talk about it with your group. And in this case, the problem is probably closer to the actual problem that you and your group might be working on. So here's the problem. We have homeless people on our streets, but we haven't got enough formal and informal resources to truly help them. Pause, talk to your group, and ask, what principles do we think we would want to agree upon for the way we work within our group and that we would ask the community to adopt as they helped us to work on this issue? When you're ready, take a look at my answers. Did you consider the dignity of the people that you supported? Did you think about the need to individualize services instead of institutionalizing or systematizing? Did you think about the importance of giving people empowerment and choice? Did you think about the difference between a model that would take care of people for a long time versus helping people to go and do more on their own and to need less and less services over the time? That's called habilitation and facilitation. Did you consider the impact on other stakeholders in the areas that you might provide these services, such as putting housing into established neighborhoods or needle exchanges in hospitals where old people might feel insecure and afraid? Did you think about areas such as tax efficiency, safety, and telling the community what's actually going on or proving to people that they're getting value for their public funds? It can be very easy to dismiss those things because they may not be the first things that come to your mind, but they're incredibly important because of the sustainability of your effort. Did you consider including stakeholders from all across the spectrum in your team, including people that might have seemed like critics or who didn't seem to have a lot to do with homelessness, so that in a way you became as consultative and collaborative with each other as you possibly could, and therefore made sure that your messages were as respectful as possible? And again, you might have come up with things I didn't think about, but these are important conversations to continuously have. And think about what might happen if you omitted something. If, for example, you talked to homeless people and government about putting a housing complex into a particular neighborhood, but you didn't think about engaging the neighbors, it might be that you created a huge obstacle that gets in the way of your whole initiative. That's just one example. So always begin with the principles, and don't forget to come back to talking about that work frequently. Listen carefully for people who disagree, because if you ignore them, their principles will also become very important as they oppose your work. Instead, think about the big tent again. The idea that you want some of those people who would be your critics to join you and help you refine your message to find common ground, as opposed to being in battle with you. Now, let's also talk about common team roles. This is not the same as principles, but it is important in terms of looking at structures and practices. You don't have to have these roles, but in my experience, effective teams have at least many of these, if not all of them. You need a person whose job is to facilitate or serve as the chair. This isn't the person who speaks the most, it's probably the person who speaks the least, but who is best at making sure everybody gets airtime, and that you stay on your actual agenda, that you don't lose track of where you're supposed to be going within your meetings or community events. And they're really good at helping you to pause and routinely see where you are. They are your nominal leader, but make sure that they are people who are great at getting everybody else engaged instead of doing all the work. That's not facilitation. You also need a secretary. This is a job that can be a bit of a grind, but it's incredibly important. This person produces agendas and the notes of your meetings, and they distribute them in a timely fashion so that when you get to a meeting, it's going to be productive, and you remember what you were supposed to do at that meeting so that you do it in between and you come prepared for the next one. And even just the business to making sure that meetings are convened is incredibly important. And those meetings might not always be typical meetings. They might, for example, be a picnic or a community event. A job that doesn't have a very good name is the whip. The whip is the person that just kind of makes sure that you follow up with people or that you engage them in the middle of a meeting so that they're actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're not being mean or cruel. They're finding a way to support people and give them the resources that they're needing. Problem solving, for example, or helping people to know where they'll find particular resources. And sometimes a little bit of positive peer pressure. You may also need a resourcer or multiple resourcers. For example, in a school, a librarian is a resourcer. These are the people that might help you to find the resources that you need. Perhaps they're difficult. They have network connections, or they are willing to go out and do them. These people can engage people, or they can go and actually catch people up who might have missed some meetings or been sick for a while. You may also have to have a bunch of specialists. Perhaps a person who's great at technology, perhaps a person who understands how to write grants, perhaps a person who knows how to speak effectively to government, just as a few of them. You need lots of champions. Champions we talked about before as another word, influencers. People who go out and tell others about what you're doing and engage them, get them interested. These are people who are kind of willing to go out there and wave the flag. And as we talked about earlier, you need lots of worker bees. These people don't really want to sit around a boardroom table necessarily. They don't even want to come out very often. But on the day that you need somebody to lift boxes or transport people or stick posters up on telephone poles, they'll be there. Don't ever forget how important those people are. And you probably need people who can help you with communication and presentation. There's lots of different ways this might be. Maybe one person's a website expert. Another person's a videographer. Somebody else is really good at facilitating input sessions, and somebody else might be good at doing a PowerPoint presentation. Try to get people to work in combination if possible. All of these roles are equally important, and this is a time for me to tell you something that you might not have thought about. When you're working in your group, there isn't a requirement that you necessarily have everybody there doing the exact same things for the exact same amount of time. People may have other classes, jobs, or family responsibilities. They may not be well on the day of presentation. So it's not fair or even a good idea to expect everybody to have the exact same job and the exact same share of the pie. Instead, think about where people contribute the most. And even though somebody might put in more elbow grease or hours in one job, there might be another person who does something so well or brings such a high level of expertise that it's best to put them in that role. Don't worry about how many calories people are burning. Instead, measure the value that they're bringing. And also be prepared to have people engage in different ways. We live in an era where people can contribute without being physically present using Zoom, FaceTime, or Skype, or Google Documents, or SharePoint. These are all great ways for people to contribute, even if they can't physically be there. Now, of course, it's important for people to be there sometimes in person, but don't consider a person to be a slacker or not a part of your team just because they don't do it the same way as you. That's another one of those things you want to talk about. What are our practices? So, to conclude, make sure within your team that you talk about your roles, your principles, and your practices, and that you constantly revisit them.